People will join very soon. Since the recording is also going on, so we can uh, let them welcomes those who have already joined here. Uh, there are few peoples they are about to join within 1 or 2 minutes, so we can. A very warm good afternoon to all of you. Uh, in this series of monthly book review by the Bibliophiles, we are welcoming to each one of you. I, Sarveshwar Pradhan, along with other members of the Bibliophiles, we are grateful to Professor Ranganathan.
Gangatharan.
Professor Ganganathan actually he teaches history in uh, Banaras Hindu University for last uh, more than 1 decades. He has been teaching and he has been teaching in specialized basically in Dalit history and cultural history in India. Uh, and today's book is a very recently published book, uh, The Loss of Hindustan by Professor Manan Ahmed Asif from Harvard University. So we are very much grateful to him. Professor Manan Ahmed has agreed to join in this occasion. It is indeed a great pleasure for all of us to be him with us. So without wasting much time, I am requesting Dr. Kishore Meher sir to please give a introductory remarks about the Bibliophiles. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sarveshwar. First of all, I welcome Professor Gangatharan and Professor Manan Ahmed Asif, who has joined from America. It has been a great pleasure to host you as our distinguished guest here in the webinar. As you know that recently we floated this Bibliophiles initiative, and this is the third session. Earlier we had a session on Restless as Mercury by Gopal Gandhi, and the second book that we reviewed is by Professor Amit Ranjan, and that was also a very good book that we reviewed in our last session. And in today's session, we are fortunate that a great book, one of the best, I think, highest selling books so far, because so many of my friends are reading this book right now and nowadays. This Loss of Hindustan. When I read this book 2 months ago, I was very much fascinated, really too much interested to read this book, and then I recommended this book to few of my friends. Even one, Dr. Saroj Das, has also joined in this webinar because he has been reading this book even today. I requested my friend Gangatharan to, about this book, and Ganga also took interest on this book. And the result is today that we are sitting with all of you, where Professor Gangatharan and Professor Manan Ahmed Asif is also there with us. It is a rare occasion for us, even when we find the book reviewer and at the same time the author of the book in common one platform. So without wasting much time, again I am grateful to all of you, because by joining this webinar you have encouraged all of us, and I hope that you will keep on encouraging us in future. So just right now I would again request Sarveshwar to manage the event. Sarveshwar, over to.
Thank you, Kishore Meher sir, for your introductory remarks about the bibliophiles and the books we have reviewed so far. The first of the kinds, as you have pointed out, the Restless, Mercury as Restless by Professor uh, Sujit Prused. It was one of the uh, first event, but it was very eventfully, it was memorable event for all of us. So, without wasting much time, I am directly moving to the author of the book, The Loss of Hindustan, The Invention of India by Manan Ahmed Asif, to give the uh, brief epilogues of the books, the background of the books. After that, we will invite Professor Gangatharan to carry forward. So, Professor Manan Ahmed, sir, please, over to you, sir.
Right, thank you so much, Sibeswar, and my sincere thanks to Kishore Meher Saab and to Professor Gangatharan and to everyone else who is in the bibliophile present today. I'm very grateful for your engagement and for reading, and I look forward to the conversation today. So very briefly, I want to say that my book is about a 17th century historian in the Deccan named Farishta, early 17th century, who writes a history of Hindustan for his patron Ibrahim Adil Shah II in Bijapur. And why is that history interesting for us is that while there are many great histories written right before Farishta and during his time and after, it's one of the main histories I think that covers the geography of Hindustan from the perspective of the land of Hindustan, rather than thinking about a king or a dynasty or a particular city. So it's a unique history that he wants to write and he succeeds in writing. And the reason I wanted to think about this history and think about historians who are writing history before Farishta and after Farishta is that this history becomes really important for the colonial state and for Europe, for their concept or what we call the philosophy of history. How do you write history? And so, in a sense, something that is done for a very specific purpose becomes part of a universal campaign in which Hindustan is written out as British India or India. And that's the kind of colonial project of history writing that I try to trace alongside trying to work out what Farishta meant when he said Hindustan, who was in it, who lived in it, where was it for Farishta, and how did he think about Hindustan. And so that project and what happens when Europe begins to read this book and when Europe begins to apply its colonial power onto the subcontinent, giving birth ultimately to British India outside of French Indies, Dutch Indies, Portuguese Estado, is something that I trace in the book. The book is primarily in the period between 1700 and early 20th century, but it's also not a book of political history. I don't really go into history of what happened, where it happened. It's really a history of historians, both colonial and Hindustani historians. And one last thing I'll mention is one of the things that I'm interested in the book is how do we think about history writing outside of the colonial paradigm? So by that I mean when Europe is writing our history and when Europe is giving us a discipline called history that we then take up. I'm a historian, I teach in a history department. When Europe is giving us these tools, can these tools ever be used for purpose of liberation, for freedom, for emancipation, for equity, for justice? And that's, I think, part of the decolonization perspective that I'm trying to work myself through. And is there such a possibility from history writing? And I think that's a conversation that I'm really eager to learn from Professor Gangatharan and from everyone else, what they think about this project. So I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Manan, for this introductory remarks and your the epilogues of the book on which the account has been set for these particular books. As we all know that actually we didn't require to introduce Professor Manan Ahmed in this gathering, because we had much discussed before in the group itself, and he has been an expert in Indian Ocean and other history. And for these particular books, The Loss of Hindustan, we choose Professor Gangatharan to review that book, because Gangatharan has been a very expert in methods of history writing, whether it is a Dalit history writings or whether it is in history or cultural history writings. So, Professor Gangatharan, you are most welcome to carry forward the sessions, and please, over to you, Professor Gangatharan.
Okay, thank you. Very good afternoon to all of you. I think so far, Manan, it is a very good morning. I think it's a wet morning in, I think so, in US. It's a great joy indeed to meet and talk to people across the borders, because knowledge can cross now in spite of differences, in spite of barriers. I think so that's one of the positive note enables us now to think collectively and argue about issues that concerns us in a collective sense. I'm sure this is really a fruitful intellectual exercise. First of all, I at the outset express my sincere thanks to the Bibliophile group. Thank you for calling me to be part of this group to review this most celebrated book of this year. We can say about the intellectual history of modern India. As Professor Manan himself, trying to bring into this particular aspect how intellectual history, takes a special way of looking at issues. So that's, I think, really enabled me to take up this issue, or take up particularly Manan's book to bring it to for a broader discussion rather than reviewing it. And I'm sure there are a lot of interlaced underlying questions that we can certainly pose to Professor Manan also. But at the same time, I understand, as Derrida says, once the text is written, the author is no more. The text is at the hand of the readers. It's the way we see it and the way we interpret it. But certainly our desperation to deconstruct also has to contribute for reconstruction as well. So which is why I'm sure what Professor Manan has started off will enable us to think loudly and enable us to think broadly in new dimensional ways. So that may enable us to structure over or look into those various dimensions the way we feel comfortable about it. As I talk about this book, I think I'm sure many of you have seen the uniqueness, the interesting things I particularly feel. First of all, I think Manan's views for the first time when I heard, I think so in a caravan lecture, I remember in the first month of January, I think so 10th, where he has given a broad, spectrum of ideas that he has really deliberated about. And then after which I also mulled over those ideas and went on to those book and keep listening and reading. And it turned out to be a great intellectual pursuit, and I found it interesting. First of all, one of the important things I would certainly say for any historians here is a classical history book in terms of the methodology, in terms of the way in which he has conceived the question and conceptualized and argued about, and the way in which he has buttressed the argument with the sufficient citations, and the citations are not for the sake of citations, but they are really useful citations. This is one thing I really found it. Almost the book has about 616 references, footnotes, in the sense, in notes that we see. They're all really rich reward that one could look at it, and I'm sure it will propel every one of us to seriously consider his argument. So that's one of the things I really found it interesting. I think so. When I was just studying the university days, I think so that's time when David Laurentian has written a famous article. I'm sure many of you heard about it. That later became part of the book also. Who invented Hinduism? And that is where this whole debate about what is India and when did this India come into being and all those questions came. And I think so the debate that has started sometime in the late 1990s still continues in India in spite of its differences. And of course, every political situation has its own influence in changing or shaping the way we think and the way in which we articulate. And I'm sure Professor Manan's this contribution into this mode of thinking is certainly an appreciated one, because we cannot simply, mull over ideas without having strong historiographical or historical background, for which serious initiative I think so Manan has taken in. And what I really found it interesting with Manan, he has come up with the propositions, how to approach the question, and then how to carry out this entire argument. So that's where I think so I found it he has really been successful, because the book starts with the two interesting notions or ideas, say the loss of Hindustan and then the invention of India. So both the things go together, and interestingly, the writer's intellectual caliber is such that he was able to gel both the questions together, both the ideas together, and be able to substantially argue his case with appropriate evidences. There are questions or challenges that we see, and then we can ask questions to Manan about the way in which he has gone about it. But as a matter of fact, I found it the book has begun with a clear proposition of a hypothetical understanding, and then he carries out bit by bit by not missing every link, and be able to demonstrate how facts can help in terms of establishing our ideas. So that's one of the things I really found it. And if you look at it, the way in which he has structured the book, it's also interesting, because it starts with the Hindustan, and then he talks of the introduction, and then the question of Hindustan, then he talks of the archive, then comes place, people, history, and afterward. This is a simple network, but he has successfully demonstrated. So that's an interesting thing. As a historian, I found it, the author is quite competent enough in delivering the idea that he has already chalked out and sketched out from his argument. And of course, when you look into those evidences, the way in which the argument goes, it will enable us to understand the tensions therein and the differences that also we may have. I'm certainly really glad to see Professor Manan's this particular argument. I do not know how much popular this argument in Pakistan, and certainly whatever may be the differences between India and Pakistan, we all have a same flavor of sharing ideas and views and discussing, be it cricket or be it any other issues. So that way, I'm sure, in spite of our political differences, we have a high degree of emotional, sense of unity or emotional sense of interest in terms of discussing or sharing our views and engaging in a serious confabulations. And I think that's an interesting event as far as this program of today is concerned. So coming back to the book that, as I mentioned about, Professor Manan's, one of the challenges that may come to you, in fact, Manan has addressed. He has taken up Firishta, the 17th century historian for whom there is not much about we have as a biography. That's an interesting thing. Farishta, one of the leading historians of 17th century, or in fact the hero of Professor Manan, about whom we don't have much of what do you say biographical evidences. But that doesn't in any way confine us from not engaging with him. But what I mean to say is that we cannot easily, compile conjectures upon conjecture to justify our case. But what I found it really interesting is the way Professor Manan has explained Firishta's argument, written in about 1,000 folios with the 12 chapters of the 11 having a clear data, the tables, and then the final argument. So what I really found it is Manan is really, I think a competent teacher. He knows very well that how to, initiate the way of presenting an argument to a new audience and make them to engage in. And I think that's one of the things I really find it. The book, the way in which the argument unfolds, is compelling in many ways to engage with the writer's argument, as well as the core of this whole subject. So what I really finding it interesting that I would like to tell our participants here.
Hello. Can you please mute yourself? Yeah, please go ahead, Professor Gangatharan.
Okay, yeah, let me go on. So what I'm mainly trying to emphasize is particularly the way he has conceived the idea as an intellectual initiative. Because the intellectual inquiry into any issues requires a set of ideas that must be strongly buttressed by sufficient facts with right citations. That's an area I found it, the book really is a compelling one. And then once we take it up, how does he successfully demonstrate the intellectual initiative has a meaning in terms of explaining those particular conceptual framework? And that is where I found it, this book requires a series interconnected questions to answer. One of the challenges that we see in the whole of the book that we see, Firishta has been seen as the major source for the entire argument. And the writer, particularly when we look at the Manan, way sees it as he operates, I think, as I understand, operates with an idea that the history and the biography of India can be, or the taxonomy of India can be traced from its nomenclature, the term that we see use India, that is Bharat. So I think, of course, we all know about this whole question starting from the 14th century, bogus sky evidence. From there, we trace on this whole idea, and then after the time of Darius, and then this whole concept of Sindhu, Hindu, and then coming Hindustan and India and all those aspects. So in which how Manan in fact responds to colonial initiative, that is starting from Dow, or that Jonathan Scott, or for that matter John Briggs, or David Morris and others, who all engage with Firishta, and then they have also developed their own set of ideas to justify the colonial way of looking at India's development from its past stories. So what I particularly emphasize is Manan's a bit challenging beginning is that he starts off the Hindustan with the Gajini's movement, or for that matter, we can say from the beginning of the second millennium. Or for that matter, little, if you can stretch out up to, you can go up to Muhammad bin Qasim's invasion in 711 AD and thereafter. So therefore, one of the challenges, or one of the restricted method with which Manan is trying to argue about is the whole idea of Hindustan, how have bud and blossomed and of course flourished richly in the time of say this 1,000 years, that is second millennia, till the beginning of the millennia, second millennium to the coming of the European stamps. So I mean, this is a bit of a problematic, classification of time to restrict the idea of Hindustan, and then the entire challenge. I mean, the entire notion of constructing Hindustan versus British India was totally a British, a European project. I mean, this is also somewhere, requires a little more serious questioning. And that's where I found it, Manan's argument, has opened up a problematic region where we can certainly throw our ideas and we can certainly generate further heated argument and as well as find solutions. And most interestingly, what Manan has argued, for which he has a sufficient evidences on which he stands. But the problem is why he stands on what he thinks right. So that is where we can ask questions. So certainly in its academic pursuit, I'm sure he has met with all the, legitimized justificatory, evidences to sustain his argument. But at the same time, why that Hindustan to be particularly from this period to so on, and even the engagement with which the colonial episteme and then the erasure, how did it happen, in which there could have been some kind of a, if not a voluntary, somewhere some kind of a forced involvement of the native scholars and native intelligentsia, and that's how this entire project turned out to be a kind of a smooth mosaic kind of a argument that we today, almost entire South Asia has now, in spite of differences, we still buy this argument. I'm sure the history of India is still being taught in many of the Indian universities with that old classificatory model. I do not know how far it is in Pakistan or in Bangladesh, but I understand the quagmire about the question of classification of Indian historical segments still continues to, elude us, if not an issue, but it has a sufficient ammunition to still make sense to Indian political classes, or for that matter, in the entire South Asia. So that's one of the issues that I think so. Manan has very carefully and systematically approached on, and which I found it really interesting, which needs furthermore investigation, because why Farishta, particularly, who has taken up Hindustan, where he did not engage in strong political history or cultural or social history, but he was trying to study about the entire canvas of the subcontinent with its cartography, restricting it to Deccan to the rest of the northern part of the subcontinent. So that means, technically speaking, one may tend to look at it. This Hindustan, which Farishta has envisaged, does not have, the southern part of India is part of it. So not necessarily to, valorize this question, but certainly those were some of the geographical limitations that also has its own repercussions in terms of the way we understand. So that's one of the reasons why I would emphasize on this particular issue. And when we look at it, the way in which Professor Manan has further carried on the whole debate, or carried on the whole concept of the construction of the idea of India, idea of the Hindustan. It appears, I'm not certainly arguing about it, it appears very much Hindustan is largely a project taken up by the political class of medieval India. But certainly it is true in terms of the political class which exercised a great deal of influence. But certainly there had been enough input that we could see also where the popular classes or the others involved in that. So when we talk about, for that matter, in fact, even Manan even endorses this idea that the entire idea of the Hindustan music, which is a cultural amalgam or cultural mosaic that has evolved in which we can see the entire subcontinental tonal values come together in creating what we may call this repertoire of Hindustan musical system. So I think that that's also one of the important aspects that we need to see in how this whole idea of Hindustan as a political identity is being constructed, in which what are the classes, who are the people involved in contributing it. If you look at it, I think so there are enough evidences that can help us that we can say beyond Ferishta and other intellectual initiative, there could be possible other possibilities that we can further draw upon to sustain our argument. So that's one of my suggestions. Another thing, when we look at it, Professor Manan's argument, when he takes it up, as he said, as he is mainly focused on from say from 18th century, Ferishta himself was the 17th century historian, and then he comes almost up to the Greater India, or for that matter, the British India. The first decade of the 20th century, even he stretches on, if you go to these forward, afterward, he goes on almost the 1947 December Indian History Congress. In which what he was trying to mainly emphasize is that the whole idea of Hindustan, or the loss that he feels, in its structural sense, that what he feels is that the loss of Hindustan was largely, achieved, if not accomplished, or initiated and executed by the colonial enterprise. So for which he sees the way in which they have started off. One of the important thing which in this, before making my critical remarks, the interesting thing is Manan was able to successfully show how Ferishta, one of the leading writers of the period of 17th century, and whose book should have been highlighted in the main part of the Indian historical thing, unfortunately, this did not assume that greater significance. So that means what Professor Manan's suspicion turns out to be right for many reasons, is that colonial authority selectively engaged in promoting and, if not rewarding, certain schools of thought and ideas, and promoting certain worlds of views. So that is where, whether they do cataloging, whether do they organizing, whether they do enumeration of what was kind of intellectual activity, in which there is a sense of convenience, comfortability, sometimes even consideration of choice of views and world ideas. So that way, what particularly founded what Manan's argument is that it was by and large not, accidentally took place. The loss of Hindustan, or the deliberate omission of contributing to the concept of Hindustan by the European or the colonial authority, was very much a project of that initiative, the colonial enterprise. That's why I think so Manan is seriously now arguing about the decolonizing process, because it has been already, whether we like it or not, conceived, conceptualized, and carefully executed by colonial mode of administrative system. And this needs to be dismantled. To dismantle it, it requires a serious process of decolonization, in which ideas needs to be absolutely liberated from its conjectural propositions. So that's why I think so. Manan's idea needs to be seriously considered to understand, and then we can talk about it. Since I have less of time, let me make it faster, because I found that the book has full of ideas to discuss, but I'm trying to only highlight the salient issues in which we can have a meaningful or engaging discussion, so that we may be able to learn from each other. So what Manan's main argument that he was able to show, the colonial episteme was successful in terms of what it has carved at in accomplishing it. I mean, what they started was a small initiative in terms of creating an idea of India in the way they thought about it. But as they moved on, they were able to collect enough wherewithal, if not ammunitions, to carry out their project. And they were able to, in due course of time, as they have done in the rest of the part of the colonial world, they were successful in doing it in India, particularly using the multicultural situations in India. India has been a land of, the subcontinent has been the land of many cultures, many communities. Irrespective of differences, it's never embarked in direct political confrontation. There could have been conflict or fight or skirmishes or even battle on political reasons or for that matter of territorial interest rather than communal or particular religious orientations. So that's one of the things I think so Manan has been successfully indirectly points out that you could hardly see in Hindustan was there any particular confrontation on a communal line. All that could have been, if you carefully look into it, it would have other dimensions more than communitarian or more than religious orientation. I think so. That's one of the interesting take that we can seriously consider. That sometimes we end up in creating what we do not want. And he beautifully, demonstrates this, comparing his idea with Veer Savarkar. Because Veer Savarkar thinks the Hindustan, he uses the Hindustan with H, THAN, which is from Sanskrit. I'm trying to claim that's the place. And we know all that TAN, that Hindustan, which stands for the nation. So therefore, I mean, if you look at it, I'm sure we are all very much aware of Veer Savarkar's ideas. But what I mean to particularly say is that, I mean, this dichotomy that we see in the Hindustan, it's very much enable us to recognize how this whole concept of Hindustan has been challenged and in due course of time, in fact, even erased. That's why he used the term eraser. I mean, very consciously, I'm sure. The term, he didn't say that the Hindustan has been crashed or has been eliminated or anything. What he says is an eraser. Eraser is a very, not a very harmful act, but certainly it is capable of deleting something. So that's, I think so, particularly found it, particularly the way Manan has been trying to highlight, and from which we can also learn, the underlying terrain, the subterranean level, the current trend that we talk about, the historical sense of misappropriation of ideas. So Veer Savarkar's statement, and then the way the right-wing groups in India looks at the issues. What I mean particularly, why I particularly bring in this, Manan is very right in demonstrating the idea of the loss of India. At the same time, in the 19th and 20th century, he takes up a set of historians like Hasrat Mani or Sibli Numani and others, and their writings, and to try to show how this whole process, what was started off by Barishta, has been also carried out. And in fact, I really found it interesting the way he was trying to compare Syed Ahmad Khan with Jakaullah, and what he was trying to show is an interesting thing. Syed Ahmad Khan happens to be one of the leading or stalwart of Indian intellectual thinking, particularly arguing for the Islamic case and other things, primarily because he was basically from a very influential Persian and Urdu background. But nevertheless, once he joined with the English service, he realized the need for articulating ideas in English. That turned out to be a great advantage, and that's how his Jam, that ledger, in fact, became most interesting outlet later period to be considered. Whereas Jakaullah has written more than 100 books, but unfortunately he's not that popular because all of them have been written in Urdu. So what I'm trying to particularly point out is Manan is very subtle in terms of observing all those underlying intellectual initiatives and its challenges. I think so this kind of challenges even exist today. And that's what we need to really recognize, particularly how this debilitating challenges can be addressed. Because language is a matter of choice, but certainly the choice of language necessarily represents a set of powers and ideas or status or even for that matter privileges. And this tendency is not just an Indian or a particular, it's a very much of a subcontinental challenge. And I think so we have inherited over the period from different set of ruling systems. If you look at it, so there was a time, particular language was an official language, whether we call it as Prakrit or Pali or Sanskrit or for that matter Persian and then English, and later now we are trying to, both India and Pakistan trying to use Urdu and Hindi as leading languages. In spite of all, we could see there is underlying tension as far as language question is concerned. That's one of the aspects which I find it quite interesting for Professor Manan looks into it and very gently touches upon these ideas. And this is one of the key things that I think so we need to recognize in arguing, because he has taken up an intellectual plane and on which he tries to bring certain ideas under this template and try to argue about it, how ideas of particular national perceptions can be engaged with particular identities. Because we cannot simply see identities as a communal categories. It's a category comes as a result of its certain ideological interconnections. And those ideological interconnections does not stem overnight. It comes through a set of challenges, through a set of difficulties, and that's all we may not able to easily dismiss. Even if you look at today's Afghanistan's case, for the world to look at it and laugh at it, it may be one thing, but if you look at carefully, how does this whole convolution of identities turn out to be a critical issue? And this is somewhere down the line very much even applied to subcontinental situation, but certainly thanks to the better established ruling system of, for that matter, governance model, that we are able to deal with this issue much more effectively and meaningfully, rather than engaging in unwanted clashes. So that's one of the important dimensions which I find it Manan tries to talk about it. So how much of time I have, Pradhan?
Yeah, you have another 5 minutes.
Okay, yeah, okay, so certainly. So before my time runs out, let me also highlight some of the flag out, some of the main issues which I feel needs to be discussed in this kind of project. One of the important things is Manan's initiative is a beginning, I strongly feel, because we need to engage with this whole question of Hindustan versus what you say India, or what we call now Bharat. All needs to be, because there are enough intellectual wherewithal has come now. We were able to collect enough information, ideas, and matters to be translated and to be exchanged. But now we need to see is that how does this whole issue of a national civilizational process turn out to be different? And another aspect which I also would like to mainly throw light on, I'm sure Manan may be very much aware of it. How do we recognize, or how do we locate Saidian or Edward Said's Oriental approach in this whole project? Because Edward Said's one of the challenges is that he squarely, puts the blame on the colonial regime for all that has happened the way it happened. But as a matter of fact, I'm sure as Professor Manan also argues about it, and it is also imperative for our side to recognize this is not a simple, imposition of a particular strand point of view. It is, perhaps you can say, arbitrarily arrived at imposition, but certainly with an involvement of the local elements. So that is one of the aspects that we need to really look in. So now we have to really, as we're talking about it, the views of the marginals or the people of the bottom up or the subalterns when we talk about it. So I mean, they also become a part of, they are also, I mean, having their own agents. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that no class is independent of its own ideology or identity. We all of us, in spite of our differences, our unities, operate with our own understanding, and therefore this understanding needs to be gel with each other in order to give enough space for one another. And only then we may be able to engage in a serious academic initiative. Otherwise, what happens is we will end up, I mean, confronting, or we end up in making our cacophony instead of creating a harmonious symphonic relationship, rather than casting our, I mean, aspersions upon one over the other, whereby we may be, I mean, hindering each one of our interests. So that's one of the things which I feel. And finally, this is my submission. I mean, intellectual history as a major historical subdiscipline needs to be further promoted. Country like in India, whether we try to engage with ideas and identities, because in India, very often see, I mean, we look at issues in terms of identity consciousness rather than ideological worldviews. So that's one of the challenges: how to reconcile with the notion of consciousness and the value of ideas, and then how do we can, I mean, bring them together, create an amalgam of understanding to engage in a public worldview, because that's one of the things, because we share a common space, shared space, in which each one of us have a valid authority or valid right to exercise a certain element of right. Citizenry or a citizenship is not gained by birth or by just ethnicity alone. It is more than that, confining or conforming to certain set of values and ideas. So at that particular point in which I think so we need to really engage in and creating. So that's where I think so, particularly when we talk of in India recently, the debate about citizenship has come into a serious consideration, and I think that's the right time. And I think so, Manan has gently, I mean, pushing forward this important question is that what do we think about the question of national identity? How does this whole idea come so far about? And how are we going to, I mean, recognize people, those who have differences with the certain the certain communitarian perceptions? So I think that that's an important thing. And in this regard, what Professor Manan has initiated, the loss of Hindustan and the invention of India, needs furthermore engagement from Indian side as well, because we have to deal with this question of India now. And whose India are we talking about? Who all can become part of this India? So that, as Manan has said, we have lost so much of Hindustan, but we cannot afford to lose that India now. So therefore, we have to make, if we not get back Hindustan, we have to make an India which is more inclusive than it is, so as to bring in all elements of the subcontinent within its civilizational process. I think that these are the main ideas I thought of sharing it. Thank you for listening, and especially Professor Manan. I'm sure we may have questions, and we can certainly engage in some serious discussion.
Thank you, Professor Gangatharan, for your wonderful remarks and insightful informations about the book and the prospect of the books. Now there are many very good comments coming up in the chat box, but let me bring into one or two questions so that discussions will be better up. Narendra Pradhan, if you are, hello Narendra Pradhan sir, please pose your
Namaste.
question directly
Namaskar.
to Gangadharan.
Namaskar, everybody.
Yes.
My question is to Professor Manan. In one of his interviews, Professor Manan had mentioned about the difficulty in, while dealing with history, difficulty in teaching about ancient Pakistan and ancient India. So, 19, 1857. So is Professor Manan, my question to Professor Manan, what is his approach? What should be our approach in while dealing with history in Pakistan and in India also at present, in modern India and modern Pakistan? How should we touch the topic?
Thank you, Narendra Pradhan sir. Yeah, the questions to Professor Manan, please, you can respond to, sir.
So thank you so much. First of all, to Professor Gangatharan for this incredibly useful and thorough comments. I'm really grateful for his deep learning and for thinking about my work. I think it's always a as he says, when the author finishes the book text belongs to the readers and not the writer anymore. So it's definitely correct. But I would say, some of the important points that you have raised, I want to take two on before I turn to Narendra Pradhan Saab's question. So one of the things that I think I want to just quickly respond to is the question of intellectual history versus social versus cultural, and how we think about ideas, and whether those ideas can only belong to a certain class or a certain segment of the society. And how do we find, as historians, how do we find ideas and their depth in other segments of society, in different places, whether we're thinking about gender, we're thinking about caste, we're thinking about various types of communities, especially communities that cannot have or do not have written records or records that can be traced through oral histories, folk tales, or other material significance. So what happens to other forms of thinking, especially for the long past? So we're talking about 800 or 1,000 or 1,200 years ago.
Yeah.
So I think we are limited. We're limited by two things. We're limited by, in a sense, the sources we have, the material that we have to say something about a place or a time or people. But we're also limited by our imagination. We're limited by the question that we can ask of the past. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight in my book was that there are certain limitations that colonialism puts on the mind of the colonized. And these limitations organize the way we think about the past. And it's not that these limitations are not materially important. They may very well be materially real, but they are colonial in the sense that they are there to govern the thought of the colonized. Now, nationalism or the post-colony or independence doesn't actually change that part of the equation. The materially we know, for example, that the Indian Penal Code, or is part of Pakistan and India and Bangladesh's legal histories to this day. This is where the CAA comes in, that Professor Gangatharan mentioned too, as well. But not just legally. We can think of many domains. We can think about the English language. We can think about the ways in which a particular identity or ethnic flavor is given to history. So one of the things that I wanted in my work to do was to at least say that this colonial episteme, this way of thinking that restricts our question making, can be challenged. So can we ask better questions? As Professor Gangatharan said, that we have now materials translated or done that allow us to say, okay, how do we think about Indian past, subcontinental past, from very different perspectives, from Dalit perspectives, from feminist perspectives, from perspectives of various communities located in different parts of the subcontinent, their relationship to each other, but also their relationship to their own space. And that's exactly correct. But I think as long as we continue to ask those questions within the colonial frameworks, the frameworks of difference, rather than the framework of belonging, which is what I think we need to focus on. I think we will continue to produce material that is the basis of segmentation, of division. And I think it's not a particularly unique problem in the sense that this is a problem not only for India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, but we see, where I am in United States, the United States historians nowadays are saying that we are engaged in a history wars. And what they mean by history wars in US is that there is a struggle over the meaning of American history. Does the American history start in 1776? Is the Civil War about slavery? And against these ideas, there are other historians who are saying we have to think about the arrival of settler colonials, when the European comes with the slave ships in 1619, or when the conquests of, even the conquest of Mexico happens in 1517. So you have
अरे मैम हम एक गलती करके बैठे हैं ना,
arguments.
वही एक गलती करके बैठ गए हैं.
You have arguments that are being made about the meaning of what constitutes what is called the oldest democracy in the world, with all the the best intellectuals, libraries and universities. So I never want to I don't want to say that our question in the subcontinent has a uniqueness because of something that's inherent in our ethnicity or in our race or in our language. That's not the question. It's the colonial mindset that we have to think through, and it's the colonial episteme that we have to struggle with. And so I think it goes to Narendra Pradhan Saab's comment. When we think about the ancient, when we think about, Pakistan very recently has started to engage with Taxila as a site for, its own construction, Pakistan's construction of ancient Pakistan, of ancient history. And we'll see what happens with Afghanistan. And you may remember in the previous Taliban regime, when the Bamiyan Buddhas were destroyed, that at that point there was no ancient Afghanistan. Perhaps my suspicion is there will be an ancient Afghanistan this time around, just as there is an ancient Pakistan that is coming into being. But I think what we have to organize and recognize is that, when we say that there is an ancient Afghanistan or an ancient Pakistan or an ancient India, what we are talking about is a division of time in its primary mode. But that division of time begins in the 18th century. It's the 19th century that organizes the ways in which time has to be divided along certain lines. I did my field work in very near Mohenjo-daro and Harappa for my first book, which was on Sindh and Chachnama. And one of the things that I learned during that field work, I was actually standing very close to the kind of opening of Mohenjo-daro. And Mohenjo-daro, I had never known this. I mean, I grew up in Pakistan. I never knew this. But Mohenjo-daro is not a settlement only in the deep, distant 5,000, 7,000 year past. Mohenjo-daro is a village. People live there right now. And what happened was that there were these group of gentlemen who were sitting, and I joined them, and I said, I was just trying to make small talk. And they had a lot of they had a lot of stories about Mohenjo-daro. They told me about who lived there and what they did and how they, and some of them were coming from books, as in some of them were coming from, as you can go to any historical monument in India or Pakistan, and there'll be a guide, and the guide will have some stories from colonial sources and some stories from romance and something that they made up themselves. But this is part of what I think is what unites people to place. This is what makes meaning to space. So it's not ancient in the sense that when we create a time and place distinction, when we say Pakistan cannot be understood, Pakistan can be understood in the 5,000 years. That's a colonial invention that the nationalism is willing to take on. We are happy to say that there's an ancient Bangladesh, ancient Pakistan, ancient Afghanistan, because it makes the nation state real. It means that Pakistan is real, India is real, because there is an ancient of it. It exists for so long, and hence it has legitimacy of its existence now. I think as many theorists of nationalism, Partha Chatterjee and others, have shown us that this idea of how nationalisms are, which is a very new idea, right? Nationalism is not a very old idea in human history. It's a very, very new idea. But as a new idea, it has claimed for itself an antiquity. And it says either claims for itself origins in language, or it claims itself origins in race, or it claims itself origins in place. And we have to understand that that's not how much of the political, social organization of the world took place for very, very long times in human history. And the people and the places in the subcontinent have had a relationship to ancient past. They have had a relationship to their contemporary past, and we should be able to study at least and learn from them without putting them under the rubric of our contemporary nationalism. And now I'll end this with just one saying, that the crisis of nationalism is also the crisis that we all face, which is, whether it's COVID or climate disaster or water resources or human migration, all of these are challenges that one single nation state, any single nation state, cannot solve. They cannot answer, because nation state has no answer to anything that is intra or post nation. They can't do it. US cannot solve its migration crisis, so-called migration crisis, alone. It continued to make walls for 4 years, and it continues to make laws, and now they will have to dismantle those walls, and they have to think about what to do with thinking about people coming in seeking asylum, or people coming in seeking jobs. No one can solve COVID alone. The fires that are happening, the floods that are happening, no one can solve this alone. So nation state has no answers at all to any of these issues. There is no Indian answer to COVID. There is no Pakistani answer to COVID. You can slap anyone's picture on anything. It doesn't solve anything. So do we need a new way of a future? Do we need to think about the future in a much more collaborative way? Absolutely. I think that's what I am trying to argue for the subcontinent, that we've had ways of collective thinking. It's not that we need to go back to 1000 CE. It's not that we need to go back to some other time period. It's that we have a future that we need to think through, and it makes it possible that we were able to inhabit the subcontinent together, that we can inhabit the future together, and it has no consequences to the type of nationalisms that are really dependent on a history that can prove itself for them, right? The history that can say yes, you exist for forever, for a long time. The historians that Farishta was writing against, I'll end this by saying this: the historians that Farishta was writing against were not unlike me or Professor Gangatharan or other people, professional historians, right? Their job was to sit and write history. They didn't have any other jobs. Farishta did have other jobs, but many of his peers did not have other jobs. Their job was to write history. And when they wrote history, they also imagined that history to be given by God or given by a deity, and it went back to time immemorial. And I think when we sit down to write histories now, we have to understand that history is a construction. History is a narrative that's made up in terms of that it's written by a human being. It has our politics, it has our ethics, it has our commitments, and in 2021 we should be committed to an ethics of equality and justice, and to think of how to write histories that can allow us a means to address our challenges that are collective. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Manan.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Manan. Another questions to you directly. Professor Saroj Kumar Das, please pose your questions to Professor Manan. Dr. Saroj Kumar Das, yes.
Hello.
Yeah, you are audible.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody in this webinar, and another good afternoon to Professor Gangatharan and Manan sir. Sir, my question is that in the long history of ours, that is this historical subcontinent of ours, once upon a time known as Bharatvarsha, has lost its name, substituted by Hindustan by the first colonizer, that is the Muslims, and again by the second colonizer, that is India, that is the Britishers as India. Can we say that this particular subcontinent have lost its original name Bharatvarsha by two colonizing persons, that is the Muslims as Hindustan and the Britishers as India? That is my question, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Dash. I think we would have to say, let's if we take your question and we go back to, let's say, 500 CE or 200 CE. What we find in 500 CE or 200 CE is that there is no political entity that is organizing itself as the political representative of Bharatvarsha. Right, so the term exists, absolutely, and we can see it even in a name like Mahabharat, but there is no political entity, there's no flag, there's no territorial imagination that is tied in any of the sources that we have that can say that this is an idea of the politics. Now, it's an idea of the sacral world, it's an idea of territory. But it's not an idea of government, or it's not an idea of polity. In fact, the ways in which we can think of Ashokan realms or the Mauryan realms are not through Bharatvarsha. That's not the kind of the terminology through which those political realms organize themselves. Now, but that's not that's not an answer in the sense that political imagination is not the only imagination that exists. That's absolutely correct. So what happens to Bharatvarsha? Does Bharatvarsha disappear because the Muslim polities begin in the subcontinent? I think if a Muslim polity begins in subcontinent, does that mean that Hindustan becomes the only political domain? And that's also incorrect. There are many Muslim polities that have nothing to say about Hindustan at all, that do not say that they are part of Hindustan. There are many Muslim polities that are part of other domains of politics. There are many Muslim polities that, or many Muslim societies that have very little to do with Muslim polities. There is incredible amount of literature on Sufi orders that have nothing to do with the Muslim political power. They don't want anything to do with them. So are they part of Bharatvarsha, or are they part of Hindustan, or what are they part of? So I think what we need to first of all understand is that, when we set up a dichotomy, when we set up a versus Bharatvarsha versus Hindustan versus British India, first and foremost, this is what I call the colonial episteme. This is what the logic of colonial rule is. Now, what we actually find in historical record, when we look at, let's say, a ruler like Zainul Abidin in Kashmir, who is incredibly invested in what we can call Bharatvarsha, and who is himself a Hindustani in the sense of the political rule that he's creating, that these things coexist. As political ideas, they coexist as cultural ideas, and they coexist as social constructions. And there's nothing that Hindustan negates about Bharatvarsha, and there's nothing. Now, what happens with the colonial rule is that British India is an erasure of Hindustan, and British India is an erasure of Bharatvarsha. And British India is an erasure of any other concept that cannot be traced to colonial thought. Now, if we begin to construct the logic of an ancient India that is Hindu, a medieval period that is Muslim, and a liberal period that is British, this is the logic of James Mill, who writes his history in the early part of the 19th century. Now, his son, J.S. Mill, who goes on to give us the kind of working definitions of liberalism, is the author of much of what we know as liberal secularism around the world. And so what is happening is that especially in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, we love the father. We love this tripartite division of history, but liberalism and its governmentality that has very few takers nowadays, and I think we need to kind of reformat our thinking in that realm. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. With this note, may I invite Sasibhushan Rathsal to kindly give his remarks and note of thanks for today's event, because we are very much stick with time. So please bear with us. Thank you, Sasibhushan Rathsal. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Pradhan. I think I am audible.
Yeah, you are absolutely audible.
At the very beginning, I convey my gratitude to Professor Manan Ahmed Asif to be present in today's interaction session. And it is a proud privilege for us all in the Bibliophiles to have the author physically talking to us, answering to our questions wholeheartedly, and also throwing light on various unknown facts, and also sharing some of the research findings. It is very interesting to hear from him that during his stay in Mohenjo-daro, still he found some inhabitants with whom he interacted, and they could share something from their memories, from their ancestral stories, narratives, as well as from the books. Those are really vital. I wonder whether some of his experiences in that locality he has shared in his other book, a book of conquests. I was hoping that he would speak a couple of lines on that, but the time possibly was very short. However, I express deep gratitude to him on behalf of the Bibliophile. This group is a very interesting and unique group where the members go through new books, study it, and also approach the authors, find fix up time with the particular author, and also share his thoughts, which is possibly not written in the book, maybe from his experience, which he shared as well as he forgot to share. And Manan Sahab was very intelligently, he has commented that nationalism is a very new idea. It's true. Sometimes I, being a student of physics, I sometimes wonder when actually the civilization got transcended from the habitat to the heritage. It is very interesting. We don't know precisely when it all happened. And he has touched very elegantly the evolution from the so-called Jambudvipa. Maybe it is a word synonymous to subcontinent, to Bharata, via the Indus or India, and other names en route. But the thing is that it is basically, I feel that when a country becomes old enough, certain things come up as an identity crisis. I think all countries have to undergo such stage one time or other. And I am grateful that he has thrown a light. I was not aware of Tariq-e-Firista, and he could throw a new light. And I will definitely, from my own way of looking at things, I will go through the works of Firista. And it is very interesting that he has made all of us to rethink on history. Sometimes I wonder whether as Indians we have a clear history for ourselves. Maybe some of the relations who have come from Bangladesh, who have come from Pakistan, they had a different mindset, different readings on history. And what we read before the pre-independence is another history. And today, history is being rewritten. And very recently, Francois Gautier has come up with an entirely new history of India, where he has touched various aspects and he has tried to give a new picture. It is quite interesting, but it is high time that we should rethink on our own history and to have clarity. Because as Manan Sahab has told, careful and systematic approach is required. What he has followed while preparation of this book in question that we have discussed today, the Loss of Hindustan. In fact, I don't know, I may be wrong, the loss of Hindustan is a great loss, full stop, because what we had earlier during the period of Hindustan, when the name we carried, this country carried, possibly it is getting digressed, it is getting degenerated with the passage of time. So I once again thank him, and time is short, and here at Bhubaneswar where I stay, we are having thunderbolts and lightning and heavy rains. So anytime there may be disruption. And I also thank Professor Gangatharan for his enlightening and very dissecting type of analysis about the book, which has definitely generated in me personally to get a copy of the book, which I searched in Amazon, and it is available for 408 rupees today, a hardcover. I will try to get a copy and go through it with in all intensity. And I thank him for giving time to be present amongst us, and also Professor Kishore Meher, who is the actually Sutradhara. He is the main string behind the Bibliophile group, and he has made things to happen, and I thank him very much. And also we are having Dr. Sujit Pruseth. He is a professor of Indian Institute of Public Administration, Delhi, and a good speaker. He also spoke on a book, the first interactive session under the Bibliophile banner. And also there were some participants from Vishwa Patnaik from Canada, and Professor Sarveshwar Pradhan is there, who has actually coordinated the whole thing. I thank one and all, and I hope that in future we will be hearing again Professor Manan Ahmed Asif very soon. And thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ganga. Thank you, Gangadharan.